Thank you, Freak, and thanks for presenting us. So, good afternoon and welcome from us too. So this report, it's the product of our joint work. So we're very glad to be able to present it to you today. It sits at the intersection of migration and homelessness, who are two policy areas that don't always talk to each other. So let me jump right in and start by giving you a sense of what the report covers and how we build it. So the report focuses on undocumented migrants, and we pay particular attention to children, families, and young people whose housing situation has come up repeatedly in our members' work over the years, and this is why we chose to do this work. And of course, access to housing is at the moment a universal challenging issue, but in the case of undocumented people and their families, this comes with even more intricate challenges. So in terms of methodology, we combined a survey among both our memberships, in which 45 organizations from 22 European countries participated, and we also combined that with the desk research and consultations with members, built on years of direct practice with undocumented people. Overall, the report covers four interconnected aspects that we'll also address today and basically structure this presentation. The legal and policy frameworks that govern housing access, the structural barriers in the private market and public shelters, the self-organized practices that people resort to when both of these doors are closed for them, and also our recommendations for more inclusive approaches. So moving on, let's move to the next slide. This is apart from the report itself, which grounds us in the key definitions we've been working from. So first, to talk about homelessness, we use the ethos definition, which understands a home as a space where we have three dimensions: the physical, the social, and the legal. So it's basically the space where someone can exercise their exclusive possession over their dwelling, they can maintain their social relations, they can maintain their privacy as well, and they can hold the legal title to occupy the space. And based on this classification, we also have like four primary concepts of homelessness, which is rooflessness, houselessness, insecure housing, and inadequate housing. Then when we talk about undocumented people, we talk about people who reside in a country where their residence is not officially recognized. And the term refers to a diverse group of people, including those who maybe once held temporary permits, such as, for example, based on employment, study, family links, or international protection, that have expired or have been precarious since the beginning, as well as the children who are born from undocumented parents because they inherit this precarious status. So, before we talk about the lived reality, let's see what the law and policy say about this briefly. So the right to adequate housing is recognized in international human rights law. First, we have the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the European Social Charter, which all through different wording and at various levels, and also maybe through jurisprudence, they stipulate that the right to housing should apply to everyone, regardless of resident status, and states should work towards ensuring that. Then we have the European Court of Human Rights, who has confirmed that Articles 3 and 8 of the Convention, who prohibit inhuman treatment and protect family life, they can impose positive obligations on states to provide emergency accommodation. And then the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights that affirms the right to social and housing assistance for those without sufficient resources. Then, when we talk about the policy framework, the relevant EU soft law framework, the most important is the European Pillar of Social Rights, whose updated implementation action plan is expected to be adopted soon. And under it, we have the European Platform on Combating Homelessness, which establishes a commitment between member states, institutions, and civil society to work towards ending homelessness for all by 2030. We also have recent encouraging initiatives because it seems that housing is getting quite a lot of attention on a European institutional level. So this is the EU anti-poverty strategy that's currently being shaped and is part of the wider implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights. And finally, we have the European Child Guarantee that is particularly relevant, that seeks to guarantee access to housing for all children, including undocumented migrant children. So regarding the question, moving on, regarding the question of the intersection between migration status and homelessness, we know that across Europe, homelessness is rising. In 2023, FEANTSA estimated that approximately 1.3 million people were living rough in night shelters or in temporary accommodation. But comprehensive data on homelessness among migrants in particular is quite scarce. But based on existing information, for example, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the recent report from 2024, fewer than half of OECD and EU countries provide homelessness statistics broken down by migration status. But those that do people, and it creates a blind spot, despite some research showing that they are increasingly represented among homeless populations in some EU countries, and particularly that's the case for urban areas. In Brussels, for instance, in 2022, we had a census from Brussels Health that found that over 28% of those that were living in emergency reception and day centers were indeed undocumented people. And the follow-up report in 2024 found many of them to have been homelessness already for more than 2 years. And similar patterns seem to emerge in other cities like Lisbon or Paris. What we also see, that we'll expand more later on, is a policy dynamic where housing provision is becoming increasingly entangled with immigration control. And this entanglement deters access and reinforces this cycle of exclusion. And at the same time, regularization measures, who are the processes through which someone can acquire regular status, they're almost never designed to be accessible to people who are homeless. Sorry. So to further drivers in relation to this, we also have the lack of firewalls between service access and immigration enforcement, and the consequent fear of detection and deportation that stops people from seeking help, even where they're entitled to it. So this current slide captures in, we can say, simplified form, the structural trap that we document in more detail in our report, and shows how homelessness becomes a trap that prevents people from getting out. And then we have inadequate or even hostile migration policies that exacerbate this even further. So irregular status blocks access to formal employment, pushes people into informal labor markets where they deal with low wages, no protection, or no sick leave or unemployment benefits, and that income precarity makes it difficult to afford housing in the private market, which is already quite expensive and discriminatory. And it's combined with other practical and administrative barriers that make it more difficult. So being blocked from private housing, regulated private housing, and typically excluded from public shelters as well, people fall further into homelessness, and homelessness in turn makes it even harder to regularize, because many permit applications require to have a fixed address or a proof of stable income or adequate housing conditions. So each of these elements reinforces the others, and this is why tackling it requires meaningful responses on multiple levels at the same time. But before going into it, we look more into the barriers in more detail, starting from the private housing market, which seems the space where the majority or maybe most undocumented migrants seem to be in. So our survey asked members to identify the main barriers to this market. Affordability came out top, followed closely by a lack of documentation, but these two often compound each other because since undocumented people lack formal income documentation or credit histories or personal identification numbers, they're often effectively excluded from the regulated rental market in most EU states. For example, to enter into a legally binding agreement in Finland, you need an ID code or a fiscal code in Italy. Or even if you can rent in the Netherlands and Spain, you still need some proof of income. So discrimination adds another layer to this, as landlords sometimes might conduct status checks even when there is no legal obligation to do so. And they might use people's irregular status as a basis for blackmail. This is also what was reported in some case in the survey, but offering at the same time poorer quality accommodation and demanding inflated rents or disproportionate deposits for what they offer. And then we have other barriers such as language, complex paperwork, digital caps, fear of detection, and also detection, and the criminalization of landlords and the fear of being criminalized as a landlord that compound this even further. So there is all this push into, we can move on, this push into the informal market, where people basically, they sublet rooms, they rely on slum landlords, they pay above market rates for below standard living conditions, and all of this with little or to no legal recourse, because filing complaints risks exposure, even in contexts where it's technically possible to do so. So when people do find housing, the conditions are frequently dire, and this entails situations such as overcrowding, mold, energy poverty, lack of basic amenities, and lack of privacy. For example, in Belgium, respondents noted that they were in contact with families who might sublet a single room, and they might be forbidden from using the common areas such as kitchen or laundry, and they will put up with this just to have a roof over their heads. Instability is also a big issue, as 57 of the respondents described the housing situation for undocumented families and young people as very temporary, and in the cases where it's more stable. This is entirely ad hoc. It depends on the landlord's goodwill. We also had descriptions of arbitrary rent increases, short-term or informal arrangements, and frequent relocations, which seem to be the norm. So the health consequences of this are quite serious, as it's very well evidenced that overcrowding and poor ventilation are linked to respiratory illnesses. Unsafe structures also increase the risk of accidents, and for children in particular, the employment or social inclusion. And of course, it's also the psychological toll of living in this situation, such as chronic stress and anxiety. So when it comes to public shelters, that should be the emergency, let's move on, the emergency safety net of last resort. So we can move on to the next slide. Think
Sorry, my screen froze, but I'm trying to get back to the presentation.
Okay,
no
thank you,
worries.
Simona.
Maybe I can just continue saying some few things in relation
Hope
to
it's
this.
fine now.
Yep.
Yes, great.
Yep,
So,
fine.
thank you, Simona. So about public shelters, their access is often equally restricted due to national, of course, national registration requirements, documentation checks, or municipality-specific policies. And the most frequently cited barrier in the survey, which I think was 19 out of the 22 countries that participated, was of barriers of legal or administrative nature. For example, in Greece, migration law explicitly prohibits public organizations from providing services to undocumented people. And then we have barriers of more practical nature, such as in Germany and Italy, for example, where you need a residence permit or social security number to access homelessness assistance. And then one of the most extreme forms, maybe, of hostile policies, the UK's so-called no recourse to public funds condition that shuts undocumented people completely out of the public homelessness system. But even in situations where we don't have an explicit legal prohibition, capacity constraints create a de facto barrier because shelters are commonly full and prioritization criteria exclude undocumented people. For example, France's case is a big example of this, where there is the principle of unconditional accommodation, but it is undermined in practice by the saturation that we see in the system. And safety concerns are also another obstacle, that is particularly the case for families and young people. And we also have the fact that shelters may be located far from urban centers, and the fact that you have to pay the transport costs is a barrier that's additional, especially for people who already live in the institution. So overall, the cumulative effect is that even this resort is often out of reach, the public shelters, and this is what drives the reliance on NGOs and civil society that Simona will take us through next.
Thank you so much, Gary. I hope everything is functioning well and you can hear me. My presentation is stuck again. Apologies. I have to do this one more time. I don't know.
It worked one time, so it will work a second time. Yep. I think we see it
Yes.
again. Yep.
Okay. So, in the second part of the presentation, I will walk you through what the shelter conditions look like, the impact of criminalization and lack of safeguards, and also we will conclude with some recommendations which we see key in order to improve access to housing for undocumented migrants. Regarding the shelter conditions, it's worth highlighting that even when undocumented migrants can access public shelters, which Gary already explained, it's to begin with fragmented and difficult. Stays at this shelter have often been reported as extremely temporary. So in our survey, 61% of the respondents reported that accommodation is mostly provided on a night-to-night basis, or in some cases for limited periods. For example, in Luxembourg, access is possible regardless of status, but only during the winter. This instability makes it, of course, impossible to build towards any form of security. Furthermore, conditions are also frequently inadequate, with many shelters being in disrepair, such as kitchens or private bathrooms, and often they are not adapted to the diverse needs of the residents. We have seen that 56% of our respondents highlighted a lack of accessibility, for example, for people with disabilities, shelters that can properly accommodate people from the LGBTIQ+ communities or survivors of domestic abuse. And furthermore, children and families also face particular risks. In some cases, minors are excluded from shelters, leading to unsafe living arrangements or even family separations because minors and parents have to go to different locations. And when young people turn 18, this is also a crucial point because support is often abruptly withdrawn. And we see here a significantly increasing risk of homelessness. Discrimination exists as well within the shelter systems, and this is either against migrants in general, or it has been reported also especially against undocumented migrants. And this, of course, further restricts access to accommodation. And overall, all these conditions undermine health, stability, and the ability to work or plan towards regularization. And in this context, of course, many undocumented migrants turn towards NGOs and voluntary organizations. Again, in our survey, 54% of respondents observed that undocumented migrants rely on these services because they are perceived to be safer, more flexible, and less likely to conduct immigration status checks. Trust plays here a central role, and we are going to talk about that in a minute, because when people perceive public systems as associated with control and reporting, they tend to withdraw, of course. So here we are reaching the point about criminalization and the lack of safeguards, which these factors have been identified as key drivers of extreme social exclusion of undocumented migrants. As already Gary explained, in several countries, landlords risk fines or even imprisonment for renting to undocumented migrants. And at the same time, reporting obligations and detection measures within public services have been seen to create a strong deterrent effect. Checks at the shelters were reported in 12 of the countries that we surveyed. Notably in Germany, this was maintained. Reporting obligations were maintained for all public sector workers and offices, except for schools and other educational and care establishments. And some recent developments have been also seen in the same direction in Sweden. And sometimes also in the case of public services, reporting is being done even though formally is not required by the law, but it can happen due to institutional culture or political pressure. And what is more worrying for us, which we try to capture in the report, and we are also currently working on this jointly, FEANTSA and PICUM, is that we are seeing very worrying developments in recent years when it comes to this type of migration control measures. Policies are becoming even stricter, and at the European level, efforts are currently underway to further strengthen and expand measures that would criminalize migrants and acts of solidarity. For example, we can refer here to the Facilitation Directive, which was relaunched in 2023 and is expected to maintain the criminalization of facilitation for profit, and even the provision of humanitarian assistance or basic needs is not clearly exempted from the proposed form of this directive, which is again being discussed as we speak. The new proposal for the returns regulation is again a piece of legislation that concerns us very much these days. Because it will lead to increasing criminalization, but it can also introduce measures such as increased raids in people's homes and other premises, which may include shelters, and it even introduces homelessness as a ground for detention. So such measures turn homelessness into a tool of migration control while creating even more punishing for people in vulnerable situations. As a result of all of this, of course, undocumented migrants are often pushed towards self-made solutions. In our survey, respondents reported that 95% of undocumented migrants rely on couch surfing. This means staying temporarily with friends, relatives, or community networks. And rough sleeping has been also widely reported by 84% of respondents, which said that people sleep on the streets, in parks or train stations. And while informal networks are crucial sources of solidarity, they are unstable and can quickly come to an exhaustion. And also, unfortunately, sometimes it can mean that people are at risk of exploitation, abuse, and all of this also only strengthens the cycles of homelessness. And at the same time, we have increasingly hostile policies that criminalize both migration and homelessness, which only deepen the exclusion when people are forced into rough sleeping. Which brings me to the last part of my presentation. I will try to be succinct, as I know we are limited on time, but we did put forward some recommendations in our
We have a bit of
report.
time, Simona, so take your
Okay,
time to go properly through the recommendations.
Great, thank you. So we started with recommendations at EU level because we see the need for a lot of action already from the EU institutions, where we call for housing to be recognized and implemented as a fundamental right, accessible regardless of resident status and aligned with the European Pillar of Social Rights. We also wish to see that EU funding mechanisms explicitly include undocumented migrants to allow for investment and support that is actually backed by a financial commitment. And in terms of the policies that I just mentioned, of course, we call for the facilitation laws to clearly protect those who provide humanitarian assistance and housing. And we also wish to see the rejection of policies such as the proposed return regulation in order to avoid for further punishing of people in vulnerable situations. Furthermore, housing must be integrated into comprehensive migration policies because without stable accommodation, it is impossible to live in dignity or to ensure child protection and meaningful pathways towards stability. We also have formulated some recommendations for the national level, which is important to bring in order to create the political will to actually move things. And we want to make sure that at national level, providing accommodation to undocumented people is decriminalized, and that clear firewalls must separate service provision from immigration enforcement so that people can have the minimum access to shelter without fear. Emergency accommodation should as well be made available without residence verification, and accessible regularization schemes are essential. As Gary mentioned earlier, it is difficult for people who are constantly under pressure of finding shelter and moving all the time to actually work towards regularization. And of course, why not? In an ideal scenario, we would like to see more housing first projects, housing-led solutions being implemented in an inclusive manner. We did not have time today to introduce this, but in our report, we do show that there are such examples that could be inspiring. Finally, of course, there is an important role to play by the service providers, as we just explained. And for this, we would like to see that services are accessible and that they are able to work in a way where they separate status checks from access to essential services. And we also encourage those working in services to partner with legal and migrant-led organizations to expand outreach in order to find people where they are and take on anti-discrimination training and advocate for reforms that protect undocumented residents. Finally, this is the last point that I would make to conclude. I would just highlight that homelessness among undocumented migrants is the predictable outcome of policies that prioritize deterrence over protection, and that the impact on people's lives is highly negative, with children and families being disproportionately affected, as we have seen in our survey. We do know, and we heard in the beginning, that rights exist and that more needs to be done to enforce them in practice. And therefore, I will just conclude by saying that we really hope our messages from today will be heard by the policymakers and relevant institutions, but also we do not only hope, we will make sure of passing on these messages and will continue our advocacy for ending homelessness for all, irrespective of resident status. And final word is just to say thank you also to our colleagues from behind the scenes in FEANTSA and PICUM who supported with writing the report. It was Gary and myself, but also our colleagues contributed quite a lot. So thank you very much for all your support. Thanks.
Thank you, Simona and Garifalia. It's quite a dire picture that we have painted, and we're aware of that. But we also are convinced that there is practical progress possible at service level, but also by policymakers, including at EU level. And I'm sure that during the debate later on, we'll discuss the very hot topics of the return regulation and the facilitation directive. But before opening up for debate, I think it's now time to ask for two reactions. Simona said already earlier on that we have gone through a lot of effort to get the European Commission to be here and to react on the findings of the report. We tried several DGs, but nobody was available to speak. And this is not the first time when we discuss this issue that happens. I hope indeed that it's a question of simple availability, but let me allow to express a little bit of doubts about that. So we have two reactions scheduled, important reactions. The first one is from Arya Schrey. I already presented Arya, but feel free to say a few words about your organization and your role, and then I'll give the floor to Ian O'Riordan. Arya, I don't see you on my screen, but I'm sure you're there somewhere.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. So I was asked to give a short presentation on the work that we've been doing in Amsterdam for the last couple of years. So I think that's I'm just checking with Simona. Would you like me to do the presentation now or? Yeah?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. Because I think what you were sharing in the report is very recognizable also in our city. So thank you for that. And I think the presentation that I give will be somehow a bit of an example on how we have been doing it on a local level in Amsterdam. So I'll quickly share my screen. We have practiced this, so this should go well.
Yeah, it goes well.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So I'll tell a little bit about the shelter and counseling for undocumented people in Amsterdam, and I'm the general manager of the steering committee for undocumented persons in Amsterdam. So it's a program that's run by the municipality, but we do the oversight and the monitoring of the program. I'll quickly share a little bit about what there is currently in Amsterdam. There's general support that is provided through the municipality through to organizations that are providing medical support to undocumented people, such as the GP or dentist, access to dentist, abortion care, and infant care. And then also during Corona time, there was a significant program on food for undocumented families in the city. And then there is a bigger program that includes shelter as well for undocumented individuals. We have a few places in the shelter for families, and also a few for vulnerable people with a Dublin claim, but with a vulnerable position. And how that looks like, we in 2019, a governmental program started, which was a pilot for 5 years, which was done in 5 different cities, and it was a bit of an extension of the work that was been doing, what happened before that. Because one of the things that was added to it was to work on a sustainable solution for undocumented migrants, and we would be looking into 3 forms of that. So, for example, legal stay in the Netherlands, onward migration, and voluntarily return to the country of origin. And the program would be run for 18 months. And in those 18 months, there is access to 24-hour shelter, a weekly allowance, professional guidance, so the counseling on these sustainable perspectives, and different activities people can join. And this program is then being coordinated by us, and we work together with shelter organizations and with expert organizations on legal pathways, for example. And so this is one of the things. There are criteria to join the program. So this is very relatable to what you were saying in your presentation about the access to shelters. This is also happening in Amsterdam, because there are these criteria around that you're not part of a country that has been regarded as a safe country, or you need to be at least 6 months in the region of Amsterdam, and the other things that are in my presentation. And just to say a little bit about the shelter, I think that in line of the presentations, in Amsterdam there are 11 locations spread through the city that are only for undocumented migrants. So there's no access to the regular shelter, but we have several, so 11 locations for undocumented migrants specifically. These are small scale locations, where the biggest one is around 50 people, and it's organized by 3 different organizations. And we have place for 500 people in total in the city. And there is also a possibility to stay in your own network, if that's a very stable network. And next to the shelter, the counseling is being given by a case manager. And then I was also asked to share a little bit about the lessons learned, and I think I was thinking about specifically on the shelters. So one of the things I think what we have learned over years is that investing in the partnerships in the city, because collaboration is key to accommodate and support undocumented people, because there are so many different organizations working on this. It might be an open door, but surely we have in Amsterdam the support of the municipal council very clearly. And if you look at the locations within the neighborhoods, I think one of the things that that we have done is we've really tried to involve the neighborhood and do that on a yearly basis to see how the locations are embedded in the neighborhoods to increase the social cohesion and also just to be part of the neighborhood. And this has worked quite well. And I think one of the other things is that we have also been trying to showcase kind of the results and the successes. And surely there are also things that are not going well, but it's also important to see what you are able to succeed. So yeah, that was my short presentation.
Thank you very much, Arja. And
yeah. Yeah.
You wanted to still say something?
No, I was trying to switch off the presentation, but it worked.
Yeah, it worked. Yeah, so far so good. Thank you for your presentation. I think it also shows that in a very difficult context, it's possible to take another approach, which is not punitive, which looks at the different options, including return, by the way. So that's very helpful. There might be questions for you later on. I also encourage people to ask questions or comments in the chat if they have them. So thank you very much for your presentation. Now we move on to Ian O'Riordan. I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name, Ian, but I'm victim of the same problem with my own name, so I know how you feel. What is your reaction? I know you're in the middle of the political debate. You follow it from close by. Would be quite keen to hear what you think and how you see the future.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak. It's a very important topic, and the presentations were interesting, if not a little depressing. Just to give a little bit of context here, it's midterm break in Ireland, so my 7-year-old and her 7-year-old buddy next door are currently trying to set the house on fire, it sounds like. So if they jump in through the door any minute now, I'm sure people will understand. So just to give a bit of context where we are in terms of housing, at the outset of this mandate, the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has set out housing as one of her priorities. My own group was pushing housing to be made a European priority. Many would wonder as to what the competencies of the European Union would be. But we pushed for a housing commissioner, we were successful. Dan Jurgensen, who has produced his affordable housing plan just before Christmas, and we demanded a housing committee, which has reported, and I'm the lead negotiator or rapporteur for my own group, the S&D group, and that report has passed through committee there this month and is due to be passed by the Parliament next month. It's not a perfect report by any means. And I'll give you just maybe a little bit of the context of what we're dealing with before I speak to specifics of what has been raised. Certainly, if you mention housing to 10 different people, they'll come up with 10 different reactions as to what you're talking about. A huge amount of the energy is about the demands of middle-class young people to get on the housing ladder. And we're in the era in the European conversation of simplification. And that is a lovely right-wing word, which sounds nice and cozy and fluffy, which is what the right-wing elements like to do. I'm conscious I don't want to speak too fast for interpretation, so I'll slow down a little bit. But simplification means, to our eyes, to the Commission's eyes, it means rolling back or reviewing certain regulations that may be getting in the way of progress, getting in the way of competitiveness. For us, simplification is a worry because it could roll back on consumer rights, workers' rights, and environmental protections. And when it comes to the housing debate, our focus and my focus has been on homelessness, but others, it has been on letting the market rip, letting the market do what it wants to do, letting developers do what they want to do, supply. So in all our deliberations, we've actually tried very hard not to come up with a report that gives the impression that supply is the only problem, or that the only problem is middle income, middle class, younger people, young professionals not being able to get on the housing market. Homelessness is a crisis. In my own city of Dublin, we have almost 4,000 children in emergency accommodation. That number was, I think, was about 10 years ago, something like 600. So there has been an explosion in it. And part of the reason, depending on your member state, is tenant rights, the lack of provision of emergency accommodation, the lack of initiatives such as Housing First, the lack of funding for approved housing bodies, and certainly the flow into homelessness is coming from an inability of people in the private rented sector to have more rights. Now, in our deliberations, it was really surprising to me that in some member states, the issue of squatting is the number one issue. Spain, for example. And we have in our report, which, look, on balance, we want to support and we hope will get through the Parliament, there is absolutely a disproportionate emphasis on the issue of squatting, because the rapporteur is Spanish, he's from the EPP group, and this is the main political issue. And there seems to be no sympathy or no empathy for the individual who is forced into a situation of having to squat. All of the emphasis feels as if it's on the right of the property owner. So, as has been said, it is absolutely crucial that we balance what some people see as the primary right of property with this right of homelessness, and that we take the human situation of the individual and the individual family to be of the primary concern. Because unfortunately we have a political dynamic where the undocumented nature of the individual, or perhaps other factors are taken into account, the addiction issues that the family may have, the background of the family, all of that seems to be the priority before the housing. And the impact of this on children is regularly lost in the political system. Because if you live with that level of insecurity as a child, you live with a huge amount of humiliation. You live with the inability to bring friends over, the inability to know that you're going to be in the same place at Christmas time, the inability to be honest about your life at school, and also perhaps your school life will be impacted because maybe you have to move from place to place. So what we're trying to do from a political level is to challenge all of this and to ensure that the individual and the dignity of the individual is at the heart of our housing plans. And we're talking more about housing than ever before. The idea that because of an individual would lead to availing of housing in the black market, slum, being forced to deal with slum landlords, an inability to complain about the standard of their accommodation, mold and damp, as has been said, overcrowding, always being worried about a knock on the door, always being unable to trust anybody from the state or any state actors because of the worry that you may be moved from the country in which you reside. They can often actually, unfortunately, and I speak from an Irish perspective because I used to be a minister in this area, the officials in various different departments that deal with immigration often feel as if they don't want to have a sympathetic view because they always talk about pull factor. If we have a sympathetic or empathetic or humane response to homelessness and undocumented people who are homeless, well, then we're just going to get, inverted commas, more of them. And that is the challenge that those of us have to face. It's not just a political challenge with those from a different political point of view. It's often also with those who are career civil servants in departments that can be remarkably conservative. I think a lot of what you said in terms of the Amsterdam experience is interesting. The statistics that you've given from other urban settings is extremely interesting, and also the solutions. So look, what we're trying to prove or to achieve in our own deliberation is that we have a change to the state aid rules so that local authorities can be more involved in finding local solutions to the problems that exist. So it won't have to be centralized so much. So if in a member state this is more of a localized issue, that the local authority can react and borrow in order to intervene. We also want to have a fighting fund that is targeted at responses such as Housing First, and we make a proactive statement of that, and that is one of the conclusions that we have to come to. So in all of this, what I'd and I'm interested in what has been said about laws to protect those who provide housing, laws to protect NGOs is extremely important as well. So unfortunately, we are fighting a rearguard action because we don't have the votes in the European Parliament from a progressive centre or a progressive centre left. There is far too much energy in the far right or the reactive right that seems to be making gains, and we find all the time that it is the impact they have on centre right politicians and centre right politics, which is something that we're increasingly concerned about. It took us a lot to water down the element of squatting that went into the report, and also to water down or to eliminate a lot of the language that was going to be in the report about migration, and that if you fix migration, all of a sudden you fix housing. And of course, I would assume that people on this call wouldn't subscribe to that. So what I would say is that we have to keep homelessness and child homelessness at the centre of the housing debate. Others want to talk about other things. We want to continue talking about homelessness and child homelessness. The report hopefully will be passed in March. Then we have a chance then to work with the Commissioner Jurgensen to ensure that the elements of the report that we like are going to be prioritised. And then there is a commitment for an EU housing summit to be held this year. I would like it to be held in Dublin because that's where I'm from. But it is also crucial that those of us who care passionately about this issue ensure that homelessness is at the top of the agenda. Otherwise, it'll be about simplification, supply, enabling of developers to do what they do and to profiteer, and not about the cases of people who fall through the cracks and whose lives are made absolutely miserable because of the failure of the political system. I mean, the last thing I'll say, Freak, and I'll finish on this, the misery that insecurity of housing causes an individual or a family is untold. If you go to bed at night and you're looking at a ceiling, or you're surrounded by walls that are making you insecure and making you feel miserable, that clings to you not just for the immediacy of your situation, but for life. And I think the impact of that can't be overemphasized. So that has to be at the forefront of our minds when we debate housing in the European Parliament, and as we push to get the elements of our report. And what you've done today has been such good and such valuable work that I'll reflect on and bring to the deliberations that we have at European level. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your support, Aon. If you allow me to have a very quick follow-up, because we spoke a lot about the housing and the affordable housing plan and how homelessness has to be maintained as a priority there. And if you keep homelessness on the agenda, you also keep homelessness experienced by undocumented migrants on the agenda. But what about the anti-poverty strategy? There was a vote in plenary, last plenary, I think, if I'm not mistaken, on that report. And in plenary, there was an amendment to scrap all the references to undocumented migrants. And they got voted. What does that mean now exactly? Like, are you or your party thinking of reacting to that, the commission responsible for launching and developing the anti-poverty strategies from your own political group, like how can we sort of overcome that message that is given by the European Parliament by voting on scrapping the references to undocumented migrants in the anti-poverty strategy that will be launched in May?
I can't lie to you, Freak. We have for every couple of steps forward we make, there's always a couple of depressing amendments. We got our 20 billion. We pushed that to a vote. An anti-child poverty fund of 20 billion. But we just don't have the votes. And if somebody puts down an amendment, as you say, that takes out reference to undocumented, it's not just far-right crazies who are voting for this thing or for these amendments. There used to be a small cohort of crazies or particularly people of a particular political bent who would vote a particular way. But that ideology is gathering momentum, and it is poisoning other political groups as well. And I don't want to be overly political, but the EPP are frequently, to our eyes, turning their eyes rightward onto those groups and creating a block of an unassailable majority. So this it's my first term as an MEP. All of this is new to me, but my colleagues tell me that there was a dynamic in the past that if the EPP and the S&D had an agreement, that were the two centre groups in the European Parliament, and they were the ones that cut deals and moved things forward. There's far too much now of motions being put down by far right groups that are now getting traction from the EPP, and then we can't block them. So it goes into a whole lot of other areas where, we've reduced funding for UNRWA to provide school books to children in Gaza. It is so dispiriting as to what you think you have achieved, and then the motion comes down and there's support from a group that you don't have control over. So these are the cards that we've been dealt, Freak. It's not a majority of progressive politicians, and people are looking over their shoulder at increased support for far right politics. So to get the 20 billion, we had to work hard to do that and strategize around that. But again, you always come out of a voting session like that, looking at what you've lost and looking at the fact that either we haven't made the case well enough, but certainly the humanity of the migrants or the undocumented is not at the forefront of enough political minds, and there's far too much punching down happening in European politics, and unfortunately in domestic politics as well. We can see it sweeping across a lot of member states.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I was wondering, very, very, very quick follow-up. Would you think it's useful to consider asking for a legal initiative at EU level on the right to shelter, given the current context in which we live? Some groups that have a right to shelter because of EU law, like asylum seekers, women fleeing domestic violence, soon with the new directive. Would it not make sense to try and expand that, also within mind the increasingly difficult situation of undocumented migrants in relation to access to shelter, to say, well, we need a legal initiative at EU level to secure access to shelter, or maybe emergency shelter at EU level? Is that something that you would be willing to consider, or maybe your party?
Absolutely. There's ECJ case law to underpin that. So that absolutely, I think we have to get down to some fundamental, base ideals of what we want the European Union to provide. We can't have strategies that aim to end homelessness by 2030 if it's something that has no teeth, has no real effect, and is inevitably not going to be reached as an ideal. So the fundamental right to housing is something that we need to pursue it, but arguing it with other people who you assume are fair-minded has become more difficult than you would imagine. because the right to property is something that people will want to defend with their political lives, but the right to housing is something that they feel for whatever reason is an overreach. But that's the environment in which we operate. But I would absolutely support that and do as much as I can to drive that agenda forward.
Okay, thank you. By the way, there is quite a few people that echo your comments on the focus on squatting as an artificial focus. So you get some support there in the comments. Arya, there is a specific question for you on whether the program that you run, like if it receives any EU funding and what is the costs of it, and maybe you can say if the program is sort of established, if it's likely to continue or if it's in danger for the future.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So up till the end of 2024, it was also funded by the Dutch government. That's been ended, but we still don't know what the result will be of that ending. But the first year in 2025 and 2026, the municipality of Amsterdam has then said, okay, but then we'll fund the whole program ourselves. But you can imagine that this is not something sustainable for a municipality to continue. There is some budget, at least for 2027 and 28. In general, on a yearly basis for the whole program, so everything included, the housing, the program, the case managers, etc. It's a budget of 18 million euros. For now, there's no EU funding, but that might be the case for the organizations that are working specifically on that pathway of return to a country of origin when they ask for EU funding. But it's also some additional funding goes to the individuals who are returning to their country of origins, but that comes from the national level. Those were your questions, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
These were the questions. Yeah. There is some people making comments about like putting both undocumented immigrants as well as other homeless people in the same shelter, or whether it's better to separate the two groups. I guess that in Amsterdam you have decided to separate or to have specific shelters. I don't want to speak for PICUM, but in FEANTSA we have not sort of decided on what is the best way. Like we focus on the right to shelter as such, irrespective of how it is organized, as long as it's of good quality. Can you say why you have opted for specific shelter solutions for undocumented homeless undocumented immigrants?
I think it was also mainly the having access to the housing, because one of the things that we did see is that if you do want to work on a pathway or a sustainable solution for people, but and you want to look at their legal case, one of the things is that you need is housing, like that rest, knowing that it's for 24 hours, and you don't need to, because some of the shelters for, let's say, homeless people in Amsterdam, it's only for a night shelter, and so that's a particular choice that we've made at that time. Yeah.
That's clear. Garifalia, I don't know if you wanted to intervene. I saw you raising your hand before, but maybe not. Or yes?
Not really. No, I did
not. Not really. Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Simona, help me if you see something that has, or if you want to react on some of the stuff that has been highlighted in the chat.
That there's a question that just came in about criminalization, and someone who is asking if we could make more, talk more about the efforts we made regarding this. So maybe we can talk a bit about the current developments that relate to this. And yeah, I think both Gary and myself can do that. Maybe just to start by saying that in FEANTSA we are monitoring criminalization of homelessness to begin with, because unfortunately we see that it's very often across member states where the actions that people perform in public are being criminalized, including sleeping rough, and oftentimes also begging. So we are working on getting more awareness around the fact that homelessness should not be criminalized and punished. And we have a network as well where this type of initiatives are promoted. It's it also, you can learn more about it by reading about the homeless rights bill, which is an initiative that we promote among cities, and we advocate with cities to join in order for them to commit that they will not be part of such measures, implementing such measures. And then when it comes to criminalization of migration and solidarity, as mentioned earlier, we have been for the past couple of years already following these two big initiatives, which are in short called the Facilitation Directive and the Returns Regulation, which is now being discussed, where indeed there are very worrying measures that will make it even more difficult for people to support migrants once they have undocumented status. And also we are now looking with many worries at this proposal that came in the Council of the EU in December, which would basically allow for checks, for raids in people's homes and in other premises. And by other premises, we understand that shelters are included, which poses a big challenge for people themselves, and also for the staff in the shelters. And I will let Gary take over, because I think you have done a lot of work on this as well. And then maybe, if I may, would also like to go back to Aria and ask from the national level how they see this, because there have been a lot of works done in the Netherlands to further criminalize solidarity as well. So yeah, over to you, Gary.
Yes,
Just
Gary.
to say, thanks. Just to say first on the criminalization of homelessness itself, we included some extensive case studies in the report, mainly talking about France and Belgium, for example, when we see these recent laws where they criminalize all form of unauthorized occupations of housing and buildings, and also other forms of homelessness. And basically, we explain what kind of disproportionate response is that to homeless, where it doesn't really solve the issue and it leads to perpetuating this cycle that that we explained before. And when it comes to the Facilitation Directive in particular, we see that facilitating regular stay is still part of the main offense of that is targeted by this anti-smuggling instrument. And also, there's not a focus on the fact that the undue profits should be the type of element that should be criminalized, because we will see, and it's something that we're seeing already when we explain more in the report, even normal transactions are bound to be criminalized. So if you're a landlord, you might think twice about renting to an undocumented person. You will think of the consequences. We also include some examples in the report where this has actually happened. And when you consider what is the actual purpose of this directive, which is to target smuggling networks, basically, and then you end up targeting people or individuals who are either trying to assist or they're just giving normal, it's part of the normal transactions of everyday life, then there's a big distance into what it's supposed to accomplish and what is accomplishing in practice. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you. I think we sometimes, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Just to say, a huge part of our negotiating issue with one particular, well, the rapporteur, I have to say, in our deliberations was that he wanted a criminal register of squatters.
Yes.
He wanted a European-wide criminal register of squatters. It would have been the only criminal register that Europe would have, not of murderers, sex offenders, drug traffickers, human traffickers, but of squatters. Not a criminal register of slum landlords, defective developers, any of that. And so, and he also wanted a line in that to say that squatting was against EU values. The only reference to EU values being undermined in the entire report would have been in the area of squatting. So the mindset of some is to criminalize that level of marginalization and desperation, not to help or to uplift. And we spent an hour and a half on that, trying to get rid of this notion of a criminal register.
And well done, you succeeded to get it out, so that's a relief. Arja, there was the question from Simona about how you operate in a quite or increasingly hostile national context.
Yeah, thank you. Because that's quite opposite than how it is on a local level here in Amsterdam. That's very true. So there is a new law proposed, and it's currently still at the Senate on criminalization. And prior to that, it was also criminalization of solidarity. That's not part of the law anymore, but yeah, we're still in a doubt on what's happening. We're assuming it will be happening in May, the voting in the Senate. One of the things that we have done in Amsterdam now that was recently signed yesterday. Was it yesterday? Yeah, yesterday. So we have asked, because we also have elections on the local level in March. So we have asked for political parties in Amsterdam to make a stand, and they have signed this electoral agreement where they're saying that in case this law is happening, Amsterdam City is behind the organizations and will increase even the support to organizations working for undocumented migrants. So yeah, that's how we try to deal with the situation now. Yeah.
Is Amsterdam alone, or is there other cities that follow suit?
Utrecht has done the same. This is another bigger city in the Netherlands. Yeah.
Okay. There is a question, I don't know if it's for Simona or Garifalia, maybe Garifalia, about whether we cover in the report the issue of eviction of undocumented migrants, and because they have like for them it's probably even much worse than for other people because lack of access to rights. And if there is any work or good practice that we have been able to find and highlight in relation to prevention of evictions of undocumented migrants.
Well, we do include a lot of examples of evictions against squads that mainly house undocumented people. And what's particularly noticeable in these cases is the kind of violence that is often accompanying these evictions. And in terms of maybe positive examples or ways that we can address this, it's not necessarily something that we have identified so far, because it takes an overall change of policy, and the fact that criminalizing homelessness itself should be stopped being an issue in order to address this. And the fact is that we see these evictions, for example, we have so many examples from Belgium and France and many cities in Greece as well, but there's no basically alternative offered to people. So it just forces them into further destitution and into further marginalization. So yeah, in terms of positive examples, I'm not really sure.
No. Yeah, but if there is no positive examples, it's difficult to list them. But I think it's also an encouragement to everybody to read the report that is available on the websites of PICUM and FEANTSA. I sometimes, if I may abuse the power of the moderator, I think we sometimes underestimate the potential impact of what is currently discussed in relation to the returns regulation. Our members, providers of shelter accommodation, are increasingly worried about the potential impact. And Simona went very quickly through it when she presented it because of the time. But I think it's good to emphasize or stress that what is in it makes the right to shelter, emergency shelter, de facto obsolete if this goes through. It does not only allow people, undocumented migrants that are at risk of absconding, allowed to lock them up. Homelessness is considered as a risk of absconding, which means that all homeless people that are in the shelters or on the street could be locked up, undocumented migrants, because they're at risk of absconding. And at the same time, the regulation would allow raids into shelters. Like that makes de facto the right to shelter obsolete, with all the consequences that it might have, practical consequences, etc. And I find it reckless from policymakers to push that through without being totally aware of that. So that's something that I want to repeat. I don't see, help me, Garifalia and Simone, I don't see any other questions at this stage. And it's about... Yeah, sorry, you see one.
Yeah, no, very shortly, there is a question in the Q&A section about specifically Brussels and the situation here with undocumented migrants. But I think because we're running out of the time we had, I will just put a link to a report which was done by our colleagues at Brussels last year, I think, and you can read more there.
Okay, so then I thank the two panelists and Garifalia and Simona for presenting, and we move to the last and most important bit, the conclusions by Michel Levoy. Michel, are you there somewhere?
Thanks, Freek.
Yeah,
big expectations here. Yeah, so thank you so much, first of all, for chairing, and for all of you as panelists, for all of you as participants, for your active contributions to the chat. I wanted to kind of make some concluding remarks based upon what we've heard today, kind of highlighting some ways for us to look at this going forward, also in terms of what's come out a little bit from the discussion. But first of all, I would like to say thank you to FEANTSA. I was checking because I remembered working together. I was just checking when. So I saw that we as PICUM did a report in 2004, 22 years ago, that we did as PICUM, but the whole first page is thanking FEANTSA. So for the access to your homeless shelters and your network, organizations working on this. So in that first report that we did, we looked at 6 countries. Now we've graduated to, how many do we have here? 22. So I think I'm really happy that we had that first experience that led to a second experience in 2013, where we did a workshop together on housing and undocumented. So I wanted to start with that because this report now in 2026 actually is kind of a culmination of many, many years of looking at this together. It's much more dense. I think it ended up being maybe 60 pages or so. It was originally supposed to be much smaller. But it was interesting for me because the first report that we did started off in the same way. And that's what I want to get as one of my key points. So the first part I wanted to kind of highlight is this legal framework. So Gadi's PowerPoint talked about like how is the right to housing seen in the international human rights framework at the global level, at the Council of Europe level, at the EU level. And I think what we've also seen in the past 22 years is an expansion of the recognition. So you can see that if you compare the same issue in these two reports, how much longer even that section is now. So we have more references from UN committees, from special procedures on the right to housing for undocumented. We had some in 2004, but we have many more. And yet one of the key words that you were saying, Gadi, was discrimination. This comes up so much, Ian, in what you were giving as your very eloquent input on children. What is the impact on children? It's come up in the chat, the International Legal Framework on Child Protection. So we see that while we have many more references, many more kind of clarifications of this link between resident status, housing, and undocumented, and that there should be no discrimination. We have these, and we have a gap in the practice. So I also wanted to highlight this in terms of children, because we see this very clearly, not only, as you've said, Ian, in terms of the lived experience of children and the lack of decent housing that can follow them for the rest of their life, but we see it as a blatant disregard for children's rights when we look in migration policy. And just as one example, this return regulation that's been mentioned several times, recognizes that in one of the articles, even there's an article on the best interest of the child, saying that it should be paramount and to the whole application of this return regulation. Never in their best interests. So it's a blatant disregard in the EU proposal itself about what is actually the concept of best interest of the child. But so the first point is kind of, we have this framework, we still have these gaps in practice. And that brings me to my second point, where I thought it was so interesting, Arya, to hear the example of Amsterdam and the LVV program. And I was also kind of reviewing, how did we get to the LVV? Was it kind of a gift from the federal government? So this leads to kind of one of the things that we highlight in the report, which is the strategic litigation or the collective complaints. And that's what I also wanted to highlight in terms of how do we also see some of these possibilities going forward. It was most likely a combination of this collective complaint from 2013 of the CEC versus the Netherlands that kind of set the path for the government to try to see how we could actually implement that decision in the Netherlands through. And so the focus on strategic litigation and the role of local authorities shouldn't be underestimated. I think when we consider going forward, what are some of the paths or the opportunities that we have? So we've seen this maybe in a different context. So granted, this was more than 10 years ago. The current context, as Ian has really shown now, is much more politicized. But maybe that's also even more of a reason for us to think about things like strategic litigation and using like the collective complaints, I think, is one where we have a lot of good. And FEANTSA yourselves have taken a number of collective complaints, even on undocumented, and you've been successful. So the third point is then really how do we, what do we look for as ways kind of to counter this at the EU level? We have rightly so talked about the return regulation. I put a couple of links in the chat. So one of them is this joint statement that PICUM, FEANTSA, many of our member organizations, many partners, Doctors of the World, have done on this proposal on detection practices. So this is something that we are all very concerned about. As you've said, Freek, part of the problem of the return regulation is what detection practices could be done. And so what would homeless shelters then be forced to do? It's also, in a sense, touching upon another area that the report talks about is the majority of undocumented are in private homes. And so the detection practices element of the return regulation would mean that the police could raid private homes. So if we think about it, the undocumented and housing is a central issue through that single article, not to mention many of the other articles in that proposed regulation. So this is something that we are very concerned about. Within PICUM, we are developing a kind of like a and all of our networks can be widely shared. We'll have it ready next Wednesday, probably on our website. But really, what is this detection measure about? What can you do as a professional, as an organization? who can you contact? So we will share that widely. We'd encourage you as well to share it. But we also talked about the facilitation directive. And I think one of the other issues that we're facing is the ongoing, so we talked about this proposed revision of the existing legislation, and there are still so many ongoing cases of people who are criminalized. So in 2024, PICUM actually released its annual counting of which criminalized cases appear in the media. And we found that there were 3 people in 2024 who were criminalized for providing housing. So to undocumented migrants. So we have to be aware and try to give more visibility to the ongoing nature of a lot of these practices that will only become worse with the proposed measures, which make them worse. And so the last point is also indeed how we can strengthen the allies and the efforts within the housing and the anti-poverty frameworks. So I think very much looking forward to see how we can strengthen our partnership also, especially on the plans at the EU level on housing in 2026. If there's ways for our various networks to be involved, if there's the big summit, etc. But I think what we all really have to continue to do is to mobilize because we see we see them every day, and it will most likely only become worse given the political context. So I think that the opportunity of doing this report together of both of our networks and partners looking at this, we hope to continue to do that going forward. So thank you very much for this opportunity to do this together and to all of you for your participation.
Thank you, Michelle. So that's the end of the webinar. It will be recorded, so you can share it with colleagues if you want. And I hope we can count on your support to continue the fight. So thanks a lot, and thanks to all the speakers.